Welcome to the Docs Who Lift podcast, where we distill and simplify the complexities of a healthy lifestyle, exercise, medicine, and weight loss. We're excited to bring you a podcast that's a prescription for clinical practice, scientific recommendations, and just real life. This is the Docs Who Lift podcast.
Hey, and welcome back to the Docs Who Lift podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Spencer Nadolsky. I got my co-host, Dr. Karl, here. Today, we have another great special guest, Dr. Colenso-Semple. She's a PhD. You did your work at McMaster, your PhD at McMaster?
I did.
And she specializes in exercise and menstrual cycle and other things related to that. So we wanted to get her on the podcast because this is a question that we get. And, you know, like
that a lot of people have.
We
and a lot of people try to sell people on stuff.
Yeah, we talk about it, but it's like it would be great to have a woman talk about it as well, because, you know, obviously we're not able to relate truly other than our wives going through it. But like based on our knowledge, I didn't want to make any specific changes in workout plans for anybody, but there are people out there that promote the idea of changing it. So we wanted to bring on the expert. Who
has recently published some real good stuff on this that we're going to talk about.
We are not the experts in this. We have to know about it for practical purposes, but we wanted to bring the actual head honcho researcher into this. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be on Docs Who Lift.
Yeah. So how'd you get into this whole thing? What got you into this?
I got into exercise science research because I loved lifting, and I was a personal trainer for fun at the time. I had a, quote unquote real job, but then I would do that on weekends or after work. And then I learned that, hey, resistance training research is a thing. And so I was living in New York at the time. I volunteered in Brad Schoenfeld's lab to kind of get a taste for that sort of really applied work. And then I decided to go back to school, get a master's degree. I worked in Bill Campbell's lab at the University of South Florida in Tampa. I spent a few months in Fullerton with Andy Galpin doing some fiber type stuff. And then I decided to come to McMaster for the PhD, primarily because I was looking for a supervisor who would really let me drive the project. And I really wanted to do some work in women. And what I realized was that so many people were unwilling to or hesitant to do this work in young women because they were afraid that the menstrual cycle, we can't control for it. And so we need to do this, and that. And so then that got me thinking, well, what does that body of literature really look like? And are these fears valid? And so what started as a question about, or ovarian hormones and muscle sort of transformed into hey, if this doesn't matter, then we should be doing a lot more research in women. So it kind of has implications for both, women who exercise and those who coach them, and also researchers.
Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't realize that this sort of background, sort of hypothesis stuff was leading people to then not do the research. I guess I didn't realize that.
Well, if you submit to a journal, the first question will be, did you control? I mean, the idea, it's just absurd, but did you control for the menstrual cycle? And that if you didn't, then you're less likely to be accepted in a higher impact journal. And so, but if you are going to standardize testing during specific cycle phases, then you need to make sure that you're actually tracking cycle, that you're assessing ovulation. In some cases, you're actually measuring hormones. And so then you end up at a point where you're doing so much work. A lot of labs don't actually have the resources to do all of that and answer the question that they wanted to answer in the research, right?
Amazing.
Wow.
And so historically, the hypothesis, correct me if I'm wrong, if I got this right, but it was thought maybe that skeletal muscle protein turnover was affected by the menstrual cycle phases. and was more anabolic during the follicular versus the luteal phase. Is that what was thought, but there was not really any evidence to back that up? Truly, that was just a thought, or what?
There's some interesting work in rodents where they removed their ovaries and saw that the maintenance of skeletal muscle was declining. And then they administered an estradiol, and the muscle kind of returned, if you will. And so that, coupled with another study that identified estrogen receptors in satellite cells or muscle stem cells. And so that was thought to be, oh, well, if estrogen is regulating the satellite cell compartment, then perhaps it's involved in recovery from exercise or from, resistance training induced muscle damage. And that has spiraled into you're going to recover more during periods of high estrogen throughout the cycle, and therefore you can train more frequently, or just women can train more frequently than men, period. The idea that the absence of the hormones through the ovariectomy was problematic for muscle maintenance has now translated into estradiol is anabolic, and therefore progesterone is catabolic. And so the follicular phase, you should be doing your resistance training. And then during the luteal phase, you should be doing yoga or light stretching. And that is how women should exercise who have cycles.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
That's what I've seen that before. So did you struggle, or did you got into this simply because you saw this as an issue when you're trying to publish other research, or how did you get in specifically to the menstrual cycle stuff?
Well, originally I was interested in just sex differences in general. And so when you look at the sex difference literature, what you realize is it doesn't really exist because there's not enough research in women to do sex-based comparisons. And so, but I did want to understand, are there sex differences in how we adapt? And are those meaningful? I think there's a difference between mechanistically interesting and practically relevant.
Right.
And I think that's, as a scientist, I find both really interesting, but I think we need to be very careful about trying to jump the gun when we're making practical recommendations.
Yeah, speaking of that, so I guess I'll name drop the person who we always get asked about in the clinic, especially. I feel like the women will say, well, Stacy Sims, who's a PhD, will say this stuff, and I know she's she's kind of a self-proclaimed expert in female hormonal research. I don't know if she actually is, but in athletic performance. And she always talks about tracking menstrual cycle to optimize training and performance. And speaking of kind of the baffle with bullshit mechanistic stuff, she's been on Huberman, I think, who is kind of the master at doing that, and making stuff up, making clinical recommendations based upon things that are not clinically relevant. And she claims that you can tailor your training accordingly, adjust your training and nutrition to align with your menstrual cycle. For example, like you said, during the high phase, you may need more calories and more protein even. And that's getting into nutrition. Now, I can tell you from our perspective with obesity, diabetes, metabolic disease, all those studies in patients with actual disease processes, they don't account for. And in fact, most participants in that research, they are females these days in the medications for obesity, and then a good representation in diabetes and stuff too. They're not controlling for menstrual cycle stuff, but it's pretty consistent.
Could you go over the menstrual cycle just for our like when you're talking about the follicular phase versus the luteal phase and when the menses are, just real quick, so people are like, okay, I got this straight in my head.
Maybe we'll have to put up a graph.
Yeah, so if you Google hormone fluctuations throughout the menstrual cycle, you'll see a very pretty graph where in the initial few days of the cycle, all the hormones are low. And then gradually throughout the follicular phase, we see an increase in estradiol, which peaks prior to ovulation. And ovulation is characterized as the spike in luteinizing hormone. And ovulation separates the follicular phase from the luteal phase. Now, during the luteal phase, we see an increase in progesterone, but there's also a secondary peak of estradiol. So it's not quite as high as that initial pre-ovulatory peak, but it is present. So when we think about comparing hormone profiles throughout the cycle, it's constantly changing. So we have the beginning of the cycle where it's both are low, and then we have the high estradiol peak, and then we have a period of high estradiol that's followed by high luteinizing hormone, and then in the mid luteal phase we have high progesterone and moderately high estradiol, and then both hormones decline and the cycle repeats. However, if you actually track and measure these hormones throughout the cycle in real people, very few actually look like that nice graph. The extent to which the hormones peak and the timing of those fluctuations vary from one woman to the next, and can also vary from one cycle to the next. So the idea that that we should be changing our training around this is also based on an assumption that everybody has this sort of cookie cutter cycle, and that's very much not the case.
Yeah, interesting. So we should throw our medical school books out that look like that.
But I think it probably helps people kind of understand what the basics are, the basic pattern.
Yeah, and if you look, so for example, when I combine all of the tests that I've done in different cycles in different people, and I plot it, it does look like that. Okay. But when you look at, big group level, but individual, very, very different. Because some people have, what you see in that chart is even length phases. So it'll be a 28-day cycle where ovulation is right in the middle. And the reality is some people ovulate much earlier than that, and some people ovulate much later, meaning you have unequal phase lengths, which makes trying to apply some of these training recommendations just way more complicated and difficult, even though they probably wouldn't make sense to be applying in the first place. But when you add that in, it's people who are training according to a phase that they think they're in, but they might not even be in that phase, because most women are not regularly tracking their ovulation unless for fertility purposes.
So you have your period, that's the beginning of the follicular phase, right? And then it's about 14 days, roughly, like you said. It could be different. And then you ovulate, you have the 14 days. And what are so allegedly we should be strength training, or people should be strength training during that first follicular phase, right? And then maybe, or high, and I have also seen like high intensity interval training and cardio and low intensity.
They make up all sorts of crazy stuff.
There's so many.
Well, and like she was saying, you need more calories and protein during that. But you guys last year you published a review of a bunch of meta-analyses, right?
Yes.
And to try to come up with at least some background to what I think we're going to talk about soon. But basically, bottom line that I took out of it was, all right, there's no evidence that says anything about this, but maybe give us a little bit more of the nuance of what you guys found in that when you tried to figure this out based upon what data were available.
One of the major problems is that this body of literature is so flawed, just methodologically. So there's papers where they just assumed that everyone has a 28-day cycle and ovulates on day 14. And so then, that's obviously a problem. There are papers that combined naturally cycling women with people who were on hormonal contraceptives. That's a problem. There are people who use basal body temperature as the way to validate ovulation. That's not great. And many don't measure hormones at all. And so then in the conclusion, they attribute the finding to a particular hormone profile that wasn't measured. So all of that is really problematic, because we have a body of literature from which people are then trying to draw really practical recommendations that are substantially changing how people are exercising. And we can't even really trust the results of these studies because they just weren't done very well.
So is it possible that there is some data there, we just can't conclude it based on the flawed data in the past? Or it's possible that there is an effect, we just can't know? Or did you go further and be like, no, we tested this a few different times and there's not really an effect that we see.
The study that I did, we tracked cycles for several months before we did any testing. The participants who came to me had also been tracking using an app for a year prior, and we used the urinary LH kits to test for ovulation. And I measured hormones on multiple time points. But what we tried to do is measure integrated muscle protein synthesis during the high estradiol period, so right before ovulation, and then compare that to another 60 period during the mid-luteal phase where you have the high progesterone, because that's the argument, right? That something good about estradiol, something potentially not great about progesterone. And so we did that testing with, what I would say are gold standard methods for just tracking and identifying phase length and ovulation. And we found no difference. And we did that as a within person design, so to also kind of make sure that everything was really tightly controlled. So we're testing all those individuals in one phase at rest and post exercise, and then those same individuals in the other phase. And we made sure that we were identifying that phase within those individuals. There are some other studies that tried to do this kind of group-based comparison, and that's not great too, especially if you're trying to measure something where there's so much individual variability at play.
So you did the mechanistic testing, but are there other studies out there looking at like differences in how you program exercise and looking at outcomes, looking at the cycle?
Yeah, there's one study that people will point to that, amazingly, they found that training just in the follicular phase led to greater muscle thickness than training just in the luteal phase or training throughout the whole cycle.
So they just took 2 weeks off.
Yes.
Wow.
From everything?
Yes.
But see, I feel like, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we looked at just good old-fashioned basic exercise studies, resistance training studies, and then in our world, very importantly, the health benefits of those types of studies, nobody's going 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off anyways. And is there any clinical relevance to it? Even if that were the case, and that's only one study and everything else was kind of a wash, and then but you guys were doing muscle biopsies. I mean, it's not like you were these were literal muscle biopsies looking at proteins, or the, what do you
muscle protein synthesis?
Myofibrillar protein synthesis, right? Like the actual muscle building.
And we used stable isotope tracers to actually trace the metabolic fate in the biopsies. So meaning we were deuterium, it's an orally ingested tracer, like a heavy water. So meaning it's labeled in that you can ingest it orally and then measure it, the rate of incorporation of that tracer into the muscle tissue in the post biopsy. So that's how we get this fractional muscle protein synthesis rate over a period of days. So if you look at an infusion trial that measures protein synthesis, those are usually a couple of hours, because you need to be attached to a catheter the whole time, because the tracer is being infused. But the interesting thing and the cool thing about deuterium is that you can ingest it orally, so then you can continue to take kind of top-up doses over a period of time. And the protein synthesis measure that we're getting takes into account all of the exercise, feeding, sleeping, everything you did over that period of time, not just the couple of hours where you were sitting fasted in the bed attached to the catheter.
Wow. Well, okay. So, and you also talk about birth control and some other things. What are some takeaways from all this stuff? In terms of like exercising and like what should people do?
Yeah.
But tell us what to do.
Yeah.
I think that your point was very important about the fact that nobody exercises like this, and even if there was something there, it's really counter to everything we know about good exercise recommendations. We need consistency, even in order to promote adherence, and depending on the type of exercise you're doing, 2 weeks off could make it really difficult to come back. If you're thinking about strength training, you need to practice those movements consistently in order to optimize your strength performance. And everything we know about muscle building, you need to do it consistently over time. You don't need to do a ton of it, but you need to do it regularly. So I think the issue with these recommendations is not only are they not based on high quality science, they're also really overcomplicating fitness for women. And the last thing we need is another barrier to enter for a huge population or huge segment of the population. Right?
That's
a
great point.
We can barely get people to lift weights as it is.
All we want is people to do the absolute basic fundamental things. Again, in our world, it's all about metabolic health. I mean, not to even mention, we haven't even talked about PCOS, which of course I see a lot of PCOS. Spencer, you might too. And then the whole thing's out the window anyways. And we just need them to work out to improve their metabolic health for that. And they might have pre-diabetes. They might even have type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular risk. And we just need to be consistent and not avoid high, they talk about avoiding high intensity training. We had a whole podcast on that because does Stacy Sims and people like that, they also say, oh, your cortisol, they blame everything on cortisol too. And it's like, no, just train hard if you can. That sort of thing. But you, hard. Spencer, yeah. But Spencer, you asked about the birth control thing. So what are some of the myths or misperceptions or whatever out there on that?
The birth control research is equally flawed, I would say, but overall, it just shows that there's nothing there. On an individual basis, perhaps if you were to measure, performance or exercise-induced adaptations on one form of hormonal contraceptive, and then you were to do a washout period, and then you were to transition to a different one, maybe there might be at least a perception of changes in performance. But it's certainly not an overwhelming amount of data that either says, hey, hormonal contraceptives are bad or better. And when you think about it, if there was some magic to the hormones, to estradiol specifically, right, then wouldn't we expect the oral contraceptive pill users who are taking the exogenous hormones throughout the whole cycle or most of it, let's say 3 weeks, then wouldn't that give them an edge because they'd be getting more of the quote unquote good hormone? And we don't see that. But oral contraceptive pill stuff, hormonal contraceptive work is really hard to do because there's so many formulations and doses and you need to standardize everything. So it's tough.
That would, I guess, bring me to also talk about, so I see a lot of women who go through menopause and we do a lot of menopausal hormone therapy, and we want everyone going through menopause to do strength training and build as much muscle as they can. It's good for their bones. Estradiol, of course, in that situation, very, very good for their bones. People tend to do better when they're on hormonal therapy, especially if they had the hot flashes in the first place. I don't think I'm familiar with any data showing differences in strength or anything like that when they do menopausal hormone therapy.
Muscle loss during menopause, whether that can be
right, but is it mitigated with hormone therapy, and does it or is it just mitigated by strength training like everything else? Which, I mean, that's obviously more important, right?
Yeah, no one has ever done that work well. I mean, we need so much work done in the menopause population. Also difficult to study because the onset of menopause is difficult to pinpoint. But I think, if anything, the mechanistic rodent model is hypothesis generating for menopause to say, okay, an ovarectomy in a rodent is not the same as menopause. we're talking like lights off on hormones versus gradual decline. However, perhaps there's something to be said for the absence of the hormones, the decline in hormones, and the changes in body composition and the loss of muscle. And that is something that we just really need to investigate, because this is something that is an issue and a concern for so many women in that population. And yes, we need to be exercising, and the earlier you start, the better. And resistance training is really important. But if we can couple that with some hormone therapy, then hey, let's do that.
That's great. What else do we need our listeners? I mean, the thing we're big on like, hey, like, don't overcomplicate things.
Keep it simple.
Keep it about as simple as possible. People don't like to do resistance training, so like, let's take away the barriers. Don't overcomplicate it. Any other like little pointers that you've practically found with your research?
I find more and more that influencers online try to make everything about your hormones.
Oh yeah, of course.
And it's really unfortunate, because I mean, you've mentioned the nutrition recommendations. We've talked about the exercise. There's also people out there who say, during week 1, you should be doing most of your creative work. Save all of your writing to week 2. And then during week 3, you should be only performing organizational tasks. And I'm like, what kind of jobs do these people have that would, so I really think, for a long time, people have said women need to be exercising differently. If we can wind back to the days of, you're going to get so bulky if you lift anything over 2 pounds, stick to the pink dumbbells because that's what the girls should do. I think now we're in a different time, because there are a lot more women who are lifting, and that's good. However, we're now making the same mistake about saying, because you are a woman, you have to do these things differently, and let's make them as complicated as possible and potentially cost you money. And that's a disservice to women.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it, because it definitely confuses the women. And I think the bottom line up front is that we need our patients to lift weights. We need strength training. And don't get caught up in all this hype. Does that sound reasonable for most people?
That's reasonable.
And be careful where you're getting your information and what they're trying to sell you. Because if their perspective is through this lens of, and hey, check out my menopause natural supplement and my menstrual cycle phase-based training book, then maybe you should look for some other sources that don't have that commercial component to their messaging.
Very good.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
Where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Lauren CS1.
Perfect. And
maybe. And I would also encourage people to check out the Mass Research Review, MASS. I collaborate with 3 other PhDs over there, and we review the latest research in exercise, nutrition, sports psychology, behavior change, all that stuff.
Oh, I'm a subscriber. So it's very good.
Let's make sure our listeners know that. And congrats on the most recent publication. So literally the title, Menstrual Cycle Phase Does Not Influence Muscle Protein Synthesis or Whole Body Myofibrillar Proteolysis in Response to Resistance Training. And that was published in the Journal of Physiology 9 days ago, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
3 years in the making, that paper. Congrats. So very excited.
We need to get you on the podcast. We'll link
I know. I was like, oh my God. Let's get this.
Let's
this
chat
is amazing.
About it.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for coming on. If anybody's listening, you got some, woman friends that are into this kind of cycle training thing that they're kind of asking about this, make sure you share this podcast with them. Share the study. We'll put it in our link notes. So you don't go down some rabbit hole you shouldn't be going down and wasting money. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, here is our outro.
This podcast is for entertainment and education and information purposes only. Remember, the physicians on this podcast are not your physician. It should not be considered professional or personalized medical advice. It should not be used to replace speaking with your physician or medical professional to discuss your specific health concerns. The topics discussed should not be used solely to diagnose or treat any condition. As a result, we are not responsible for any unwanted medical outcomes. The views and opinions discussed are of those of the host only and do not represent those of any other entities.